She never screamed. Not when his fist connected with her jaw. Not even when his fingers dug into her hair, yanking her head back until she thought her neck would snap. The only sound that came from her lips was a ghost of a word, a whisper. Please. Clayton looked down at her, and there was nothing in his eyes. Not anger, not lust. Just a cold, dead emptiness, like a frozen lake. He saw her as something you scrape off the bottom of your boot, a piece of dirt where it shouldn't be. He didn't care that she begged. He didn't care that she bled. And when he was done using her, breaking her into pieces on the floor of the room she was paid to keep clean, he gave the order. He looked her straight in the eye, his voice as calm as a Sunday morning preacher. Take her out to the creek. Tie her up. Make sure she don't float. Ellie was just a housemaid. She swept floors. She changed sheets. She knew her place. But she'd made one mistake. She said no. And Clayton, the sheriff's son, was a man who owned the whole town. He wasn't used to hearing that word. He didn't know what it meant. So he taught her a lesson. Now she was sitting in the back of a rickety wagon, wrists bound tight with rough rope that bit into her skin. Her clothes were torn, her mouth was swollen, and every part of her screamed with a pain so deep it had no sound. She was heading to her grave. The man driving the wagon was one of Clayton's boys, Tommy. He kept glancing back at her in the moonlight, his knuckles white on the reins. He was young, barely a man, with eyes that looked like they'd seen too much already. His hands weren't steady. He didn't say a word, not for miles, not until the wagon creaked to a stop on a dirt path beside a dark, quiet stream, the water whispering secrets to the reeds. He climbed down from the seat, his movements jerky. He lit a cigarette, the tiny flame trembling in his hands. He took a long drag, the smoke pluming into the cold night air. For a full minute, he just stood there, a shadow against the stars. Then he walked to the back of the wagon and looked at her. Really looked at her. You weren't supposed to look me in the eyes, he mumbled, his voice rough. Ellie didn't answer. She just held his gaze, her own eyes burning with a fire he hadn't expected. You know what he told me I gotta do? Tommy flicked the cigarette butt into the dirt. It glowed for a second, then died. He said if I don't, I'm next. His voice cracked on the last word. Something inside him just broke. You didn't deserve this, he whispered to the night. He looked up at the sky, as if searching for an answer that wasn't there. Then he swore under his breath, a sharp, bitter sound. He pulled a knife from his belt. The blade caught the moonlight. Ellie flinched. She thought this was it, the final cut. But instead of touching her throat, he reached for her hands, and he started sawing at the ropes. You walk north, he said, his voice urgent, low. Keep walking. Don't you dare stop. Don't you dare look back. Maybe you'll find something. Maybe you won't. The ropes fell away. Her hands were free, but they were numb, useless. Ellie didn't move. Her legs wouldn't obey. Her mind was a fog of pain and shame, but her eyes were clear, and they were watching him. Tommy scrambled back onto the wagon without another word, whipping the horse into a panicked gallop. He disappeared into the darkness, leaving a cloud of dust behind. He left her for dead, just in a different way. By the time the sun started to bleed over the horizon, Ellie was crawling through the dry grass, over sharp rocks, her body a single, unified scream of agony. She had no destination, just a desperate, primal need to move. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a place forgotten by maps and men, stood an old ranch, a broken-down cabin surrounded by a sagging fence. That's where Jonas lived. He was a man who had already buried his past, his love, his hope. He had nothing left to lose. He stepped out onto his porch at dawn, a tin cup of coffee in his hand, and he saw her, a shape in the distance, a broken thing stumbling through the dust. He watched her get closer, A girl in rags, barefoot, with blood on her skin and a face swollen with bruises. She took a few more steps, then collapsed, but she was still breathing. Jonas didn't run. He didn't call out. He just set his cup down and walked towards her, his steps slow and deliberate. When he reached her, she managed to lift her head. Her eyes were barely open, but they found his, and she whispered the only words she had left. "Please, don't judge me." Jonas looked down at her, and what he felt wasn't pity. It wasn't fear. It was something else, something heavy and familiar, like the ghost of an old wound. He reached out his hand, and in that one small gesture, the world shifted on its axis. But what Jonas didn't know, what Ellie couldn't possibly imagine, was that Tommy hadn't just cut her loose out of kindness. He had sent her north for a reason. He had sent her straight to the one man in the entire territory who hated the sheriff even more than she did. Jonas didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what happened. Words were useless things out here. He just gently lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of twigs and pain. He carried her past the broken fence, through the creaking door of the cabin that hadn't known the touch of another living soul in a decade. The place smelled of dust, old wood, and the faint scent of smoke from a long-dead fire. A single bed was pressed against the far wall, the blanket on it faded and worn, but folded with a strange, lingering care. It had belonged to his wife. Jonas hadn't touched it since the day the fever stole her breath. He laid Ellie down on that bed. He moved with a slowness that felt like a prayer, as if any sudden motion might cause her to crumble into dust. She didn't fight him. She didn't even cry. She just stared up at the wooden ceiling, her eyes vacant, as if she were still tied up in the back of that wagon, watching the stars blur by. He left a bucket of clean water, a loaf of stale bread, and a soft cloth on a crate beside the bed. Then he went back outside, sat on his porch steps with his cold coffee, and stared out at the dark, silent hills. For the first time in 10 years, his chest ached with something other than his own grief. By morning, the bread was gone. The water bucket was half empty. And Jonas noticed something else. The small, cracked mirror that hung above the washstand had been covered. A dirty towel was draped over it. She couldn't bear to see her own face. For 3 days, a silence as thick as wool filled the cabin. Ellie never spoke. Her eyes, wide and haunted, followed Jonas whenever he entered with a bowl of thin stew or a piece of jerky, but her lips remained sealed. Sometimes he'd see her just holding a needle and a small scrap of cloth he'd left out. Not sewing, just holding them. As if the memory of how to make a stitch was the last piece of herself she still recognized. On the evening of the 4th day, she finally spoke. Her voice was a dry rasp, like leaves skittering across stone, but it was steady. She was staring at the needle in her hand. "If I can still remember how to do this," she said, her gaze fixed on the glint of steel. "Does that mean I'm still a person?" Jonas had no answer. He was a man of fences and horses, not words. He just stood there, his shadow long on the floorboards, until she finally turned her face to the wall. After that, the story started to leak out. Not all at once, but in broken pieces. A name dropped here, a place mentioned there, sheriff's house, Clayton, said no. By the 3rd night of talking, Jonas had gathered enough of the shattered fragments to see the whole ugly picture. The lawman's son, a girl who dared to refuse him, an order to make her disappear. A cold knot tightened in Jonas's gut. The law in this town was the sheriff, and the sheriff's son was the devil who wore his father's protection like a cloak. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. But as he sat on the porch that night, the wind whispering through the dry grass, he felt an old fire rekindle in his belly. A fire he thought had been extinguished the day he shoveled dirt onto his wife's coffin. This girl wasn't his kin. She wasn't his responsibility, but leaving her to be silenced felt like a betrayal, not just of her, but of his wife's memory. Because the fever that took his wife, Sarah, it hadn't been a fever at all. That was just the story the sheriff told everyone, the story Jonas had been forced to live with. The truth was uglier. Sarah had seen something she shouldn't have. She had threatened to speak. And then a sudden sickness had taken her in the night. A sickness that the doctor, a man who owed the sheriff his job, had been quick to name. Jonas had been a coward then. Drowned in grief, he had let them bury his wife along with the truth. Now the truth had stumbled onto his doorstep, bruised and bleeding, and asked him for help. This wasn't just about keeping a girl alive anymore. This was about deciding if he was going to die a coward. And while Jonas wrestled with the ghosts of his past, Clayton was starting to get impatient. He hadn't heard from Tommy. The girl's body hadn't washed up downstream. Whispers were starting. People in town had seen the wagon head out, but they hadn't seen it come back with an empty bed. Clayton felt a prickle of annoyance. It was a loose end. And Clayton didn't like loose ends. So he sent his other man, Jack. Jack wasn't like Tommy. Jack didn't have a conscience. Jack enjoyed his work, and his first stop was going to be the last place Tommy was seen, the local saloon where the bartender knew something. The bartender had heard Tommy asking about the old recluse who lived up north, the man who lost his wife to a fever all those years ago. Clayton wasn't a patient man. When a week passed and there was no body, no confirmation, just a dead silence from the hills, the annoyance simmering in his gut began to boil. He strode into the saloon, the bat-wing doors swinging wildly behind him, and the entire room fell silent. He didn't have to ask. Tommy was there, huddled in a corner, trying to make a glass of cheap whiskey last all night. Clayton didn't say a word. He just walked over, grabbed Tommy by the scruff of his neck, and dragged him outside into the dusty street. The first punch was a blur. It split Tommy's lip, sending a spray of blood onto the dirt. The second one drove the air from his lungs, doubling him over. Clayton grabbed a fistful of his shirt, slammed him against the saloon wall, and pressed his face into the rough wood. "You think I'm a fool?" Clayton's voice was a low, venomous hiss, for Tommy's ears only. "You think you can look me in the eye and lie?" Tommy choked, tasting blood and splintered wood. I did what you said." "Liar," Clayton spat. "I sent Jack to poke around. He found wagon tracks near the old Miller place, the ones that went north, not the ones that went to the creek." Clayton pulled him back, only to slam him against the wall again. The impact rattled Tommy's teeth. "You had one job, one simple job." He let him drop to the ground in a heap. Clayton stood over him, straightening his coat, looking down as if Tommy were nothing more than a stubborn stain. "You're going to fix this," Clayton said, his voice returning to that unnerving calm. "You're going to ride back out there. You're going to find her. And you're going to finish what you started." He nudged Tommy's ribs with the toe of his expensive boot. "Or the next body they find in that creek will be yours. You understand me?" Tommy could only manage a weak, bloody nod. Clayton left him there, broken and humiliated in the middle of the street, but he had burned a single, final order into Tommy's soul. Finish the job. That night, Tommy rode out again. Same horse, same path into the hills, but this time, the weight on his soul was 100 times heavier. It wasn't just the pistol in his holster, it was the choice that came with it. A choice between his life and hers. He found the ranch easily enough. A single light burned in the cabin window, a tiny flicker of defiance against the vast, crushing darkness. Ellie was sitting on the porch steps. She heard the horse approaching and looked up. Her face, bathed in the soft yellow lamplight, went pale. The bruises had started to fade, but the fear in her eyes was fresh. She knew why he was there. Tommy slid off his horse, his legs unsteady. He pulled the gun, The metal was cold and heavy in his trembling hand. He tried to raise it, to point it, but his arm felt like it was made of lead. They know, he stammered, the words catching in his throat. He knows. He said if I don't. Ellie slowly got to her feet. She stood there, barefoot in the dirt, her frame thin and fragile. But she stood tall, and her voice, when it came, was not a whisper. It was as clear and cold as the night air. You already had your chance to kill me. Her words hit him harder than Clayton's fist. And you chose to let me live. Something inside Tommy finally shattered. The gun slipped from his fingers, thudding softly in the dust. He dropped to his knees, his shoulders shaking. Tears carved clean paths through the grime and dried blood on his face. I can't, he sobbed, the sound raw and wretched. I couldn't do it then. I can't do it now. The cabin door creaked open. Jonas stepped out of the shadows, a long rifle held steady in his hands. He wasn't aiming it. He was just holding it. His face was calm, his eyes hard as flint. His voice cut through the boy's weeping like a razor. Then it's time you pick a side, son. Jonas took a step forward, the rifle never wavering. You can die on your knees for him, or you can stand on your feet with her. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the wind and Tommy's ragged breaths. He looked from the gun in the dirt to the fierce hope in Ellie's eyes, to the unyielding promise of death in Jonas's. And for the first time in his miserable life, Tommy made a choice that was his own. He slowly, shakily got to his feet. He didn't look back at the town. He didn't think about Clayton. He stood. But just as a sliver of relief passed between the three of them, another sound drifted on the night air. The sound of more horses. At least two of them. Coming fast. Jack hadn't just been poking around. He'd been following Tommy, and he hadn't come alone. Inside. Now! Jonas hissed, his calmness replaced by a sudden sharp urgency. He shoved Tommy towards the door, pulling Ellie in behind him. He slammed the heavy oak door shut and slid a thick wooden bar into place just as the first gunshot cracked through the night, splintering the wood right next to his head. The fight wasn't waiting to happen. It was already here. The siege had begun. Get down! Jonas yelled, shoving Ellie and Tommy towards the floor. Another bullet ripped through the thin cabin wall, whizzing past where Tommy's head had been moments before. Wood chips exploded into the air. How many? Jonas crawled to the small, grimy window, peering through a crack in the shutter. 2, Tommy choked out, his face pressed against the rough floorboards. It's Jack, and probably one of the deputies, Miller. Jonas grunted. Jack's a snake. Miller's just a dog on a leash, but a dog with a gun is still a dog with a gun. Outside, Jack's voice boomed, full of smug confidence. Jonas, we know she's in there. The sheriff's son just wants his property back. Send out the girl, and we'll leave you and your broken-down shack alone. Ellie flinched at the word, property. A low growl rumbled in Jonas's chest. He's lying, Jonas said, his voice flat. They won't leave any witnesses. He looked at Tommy. You got a gun? Tommy shook his head, his eyes wide with terror. I dropped it. Idiot, Jonas muttered, but there was no time for anger. He crawled to an old sea chest in the corner of the room, throwing it open. Inside, beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets, was another rifle and a heavy-looking pistol. He tossed the pistol to Tommy. You know how to use that? Tommy nodded, fumbling with the weapon. A little. Good. Don't shoot at shadows. Wait till you see a man. Aim for the chest. Jonas turned to Ellie, who was huddled against the wall, her hands over her ears. Her eyes were squeezed shut, as if she could block out the nightmare unfolding around her. Ellie, Jonas said, his voice softer but firm. I need you to load for me. Can you do that? She looked at him, her face a mask of pure terror. I need you to be strong now, he said, holding her gaze. Just for a little while longer. Something in his eyes, a quiet, steady strength, seemed to cut through her fear. She gave a small, jerky nod. He pushed a heavy box of cartridges towards her. Her hands shook violently, but she opened it. Another shot rang out, this one shattering the glass of the window, sending shards flying into the room. "They're getting impatient," Jonas said, positioning his rifle in the window frame. "Tommy, you take the back." Tommy scrambled towards the cabin's only other window, which looked out over a barren patch of rock and scrub. He peered out, his heart hammering against his ribs. For a few minutes, there was only silence. A tense, waiting quiet that was worse than the shooting. They were circling, looking for a weak spot. Then a dark shape darted from behind the well towards the side of the cabin. Jonas fired. The rifle's roar filled the small room, deafening them. A pained yell echoed from outside, followed by a string of curses. "Got one," Jonas said, his voice grim. "Winged him, I think." But the shot had given away his position. 2 bullets slammed into the wall around his window almost instantly. He ducked back, splinters stinging his cheek. Suddenly, Tommy yelled from the back window, "Jonas! They're at the barn!" Jonas's blood ran cold. The barn was old, dry as tinder and full of hay. "They're trying to burn us out," he realized aloud. Before he could even process the thought, a flicker of orange light danced outside the back window. The light grew brighter, hungrier. The smell of smoke began to snake through the cracks in the cabin walls. Panic seized Tommy. "We're trapped! We're gonna burn alive!" "Shut up!" Jonas snapped. He looked around the cabin, his eyes wild and calculating. The fire was spreading fast. The barn was already engulfed, casting terrifying, dancing shadows all around them. The heat was becoming unbearable. They had only minutes before the cabin itself caught fire. There was only one way out. "The cellar," Jonas said, kicking aside a threadbare rug in the center of the room to reveal a thick trapdoor with an iron ring. "Get it open." Tommy fumbled with the ring, his hands slick with sweat. He heaved, and the heavy door groaned open, revealing a set of steep stone steps leading down into pitch blackness. A gust of cool, earthy air rushed up to meet them. "Ellie, you first," Jonas commanded, pulling her towards the opening. She hesitated, staring down into the abyss. "Go!" he yelled, just as the roof above them began to crackle and groan. She scrambled down the steps. Tommy followed right behind her. Jonas grabbed the extra ammunition and his wife's old pistol, then backed towards the cellar, firing one last shot out the window to keep their heads down. He slammed the trapdoor shut just as a piece of the burning roof crashed down onto it. Darkness enveloped them, absolute and suffocating. All they could hear was the roar of the fire above and the frantic pounding of their own hearts. They were alive, but they were buried. And Jack knew it. He'd seen the trapdoor before, years ago. He knew it led to an old mining tunnel that came out in the rocks half a mile away. He wasn't trying to burn them alive. He was flushing them out, like rats from a hole, and he and Miller were already heading for the exit, waiting for them. The air in the cellar was thick and musty, tasting of dirt and damp stone. Above them, the world was ending in fire. The roar was a physical presence, pressing down on the trapdoor, and they could hear the heavy thud of collapsing timbers. "Is this it?" Tommy's voice was a panicked whisper in the blackness. "Are we just going to wait here till they leave?" "They're not leaving," Jonas said. His voice was unnervingly calm. He struck a match, and the sudden flare of light threw their terrified faces into sharp relief. He lit a single, sputtering lantern he'd grabbed before closing the door. "That fire wasn't to kill us. It was to move us. This cellar connects to an old prospecting tunnel. It lets out in the rocks up the ridge." Ellie looked at him, her eyes wide in the flickering light. "How do you know?" "My wife and I, we dug it," Jonas said, a shadow of pain crossing his face. "Just in case. In case the world ever came for us." His gaze turned hard. "Jack knows about it. He's not stupid. He and Miller will be waiting for us at the exit." The hope that had flickered in the cellar died just as quickly as it was born. They had escaped the fire only to walk into a waiting gun. "So what do we do?" Tommy asked, his voice trembling. "There's no other way out." Jonas looked from Tommy's terrified face to Ellie's pale, determined one. He saw the fire reflected in her eyes, but it wasn't just the lantern light. It was something else, a cold, hard resolve. "Yes, there is," Jonas said slowly, a dangerous idea forming in his mind. "The main tunnel leads north, but there's a side shaft, barely more than a crawl space. They won't be expecting it. It comes out lower down, near the creek." "They'll see us," Tommy argued. "It's a clear shot from the ridge." "Not if we wait," Jonas said. "We wait until the fire dies down, until they think we're either dead or long gone. We wait until the hour before dawn, the darkest part of the night." He looked at the pistol in Tommy's hand. "But we're not running. We're going back." Tommy stared at him as if he were insane. "Back? Back to town? Clayton will kill us on sight." "Not if we have something he wants," Jonas said. He turned to Ellie. "You worked in that house. You cleaned his room. Is there anything he keeps hidden? Something he wouldn't want his father, the sheriff, to find?" Ellie frowned, her mind racing back through the blur of terror and humiliation. She thought of the dust cloths, the smell of polish, the heavy oak furniture. And then an image surfaced. A small, intricately carved wooden box he kept locked in the bottom drawer of his wardrobe. He never let her touch it. Once, she had accidentally knocked it while cleaning, and the look he had given her was pure poison. She had heard something rattle inside. "A box," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "A wooden box. He keeps it hidden. Locked." Jonas's eyes gleamed in the lantern light. "Trophies." The word hung in the air, cold and ugly. "That's our leverage," Jonas said. "That's what we're going back for. We're not going to hide from the monster anymore. We're going to walk right into his den and steal his teeth." He looked at them, his face set like stone. "But it's a long shot. We might not make it." Tommy looked at Ellie. He saw the girl he'd been ordered to kill, who had survived fire and bullets, who was now being asked to walk back into the lion's mouth. He saw the old man who had lost everything, but was still willing to fight. He thought of his own miserable life, always taking orders, always running scared. "I'm in," Tommy said, his voice surprisingly firm. He gripped the pistol tighter. Jonas looked at Ellie. He didn't ask. He just waited. She thought of the box. She thought of the cold, dead look in Clayton's eyes, and she realized that hiding for the rest of her life wasn't living. It was just a slower way to die. "I'll show you where it is," she said. The plan was suicide. But it was better than the slow death of fear. Down in the dark, with the ruins of their only sanctuary burning above them, the three of them made a pact. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were hunters, and their prey was the most dangerous man in the county. But as they prepared for their desperate gamble, they had no idea of the true horror that lay waiting inside that little wooden box. It was far worse than just trophies. It was a ledger of every sin the sheriff and his son had ever committed, and one of those sins had Jonas's wife's name written next to it. They waited in the suffocating darkness for hours. The roar of the fire above them slowly faded to an angry crackle, then to an eerie silence broken only by the groan of cooling timbers. The air in the tunnel grew thin, but their resolve hardened with every passing minute. Jonas led the way, the lantern held low. The side shaft was exactly as he'd remembered it, a narrow, claustrophobic crack in the rock. They had to crawl on their hands and knees, the damp earth staining their clothes, the sharp stones digging into their skin. Ellie moved with a grim determination, the memory of Clayton's room burning in her mind, fueling her forward. Tommy, bringing up the rear, kept looking back as if expecting Jack's face to appear in the darkness. They emerged from the tunnel into the pre-dawn gloom, shivering in the cold air. The creek was a silver ribbon in the faint light, Above them, on the ridge, they could just make out two silhouettes against the paling sky. Jack and Miller, still waiting, still watching the wrong exit. "Stay low," Jonas whispered, and they crept along the bank of the creek, using the thick reeds and shadows as cover. They moved like ghosts, their bare feet making no sound on the soft earth. The journey back to town was a long, tense march through the wilderness. Every snapped twig, every hoot of an owl sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. They reached the edge of town as the first rays of sunlight touched the steeple of the church. The streets were deserted. It was the sleeping hour, the brief moment of peace before the world woke up. "The sheriff's house backs onto the livery," Tommy whispered, pointing. "There's a window in the pantry. It's never locked." "A distraction," Jonas said. "Tommy, you know the deputy's patrol route?" Tommy nodded. "Miller's replacement, a kid named Peters, he walks past the saloon at precisely sunup." "Good." Jonas turned to him. "Start a fire. In the alley behind the saloon. Not a big one. Just enough smoke to draw attention. It'll pull Peters away from the main street. It'll give us the time we need." Tommy looked terrified. This was no longer about survival. This was a deliberate act of war. But he nodded, clutching the pistol Jonas had given him. "All right." "Go," Jonas ordered. Tommy slipped away into the shadows, a ghost on a desperate mission. Jonas then looked at Ellie. "Are you ready for this?" She didn't answer with words. She just met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw a woman he didn't recognize. The frightened, broken girl was gone. In her place was someone forged in fire and fear, and she was done being afraid. They waited. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, in the distance, a faint shout, followed by the smell of smoke. The distraction had begun. "Now," Jonas said. They moved quickly, darting across the empty street and into the alley behind the sheriff's house. Just as Tommy had said, the pantry window was unlocked. It slid open with a faint squeak. Jonas hoisted Ellie up, and she slipped through the narrow opening, landing silently inside. A moment later, she unlatched the back door. The house was still and quiet. The air was thick with the smell of beeswax and Clayton's cheap cologne. For Ellie, every scent, every shadow, was a memory. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her feet were steady as she led Jonas through the sleeping house, up the grand staircase. Clayton's room was at the end of the hall. The door was unlocked. They slipped inside. The room was just as she remembered it. Clothes strewn over a chair, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the nightstand. It was the room of a man who never had to clean up his own messes. Ellie went straight to the wardrobe. Her hands trembled as she reached for the bottom drawer. She pulled it open, and there it was, the small, carved wooden box. It was heavier than it looked. "It's locked," she whispered. Jonas didn't hesitate. He pulled a small, wicked-looking knife from his boot and wedged the tip into the lock. With a sharp twist, there was a sickening crack of splintering wood. The lock was broken. He lifted the lid. Ellie braced herself for what she might see: a lock of hair, a piece of ribbon, a woman's earring, trophies. But it was worse. So much worse. The box was filled with objects, yes, a silver locket, a man's wedding band, a child's small leather shoe. But underneath them was a small, leather-bound ledger. Jonas picked it up. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside, in neat, cold handwriting, was a list of names. Beside each name was a date and a number, a payment, and next to some, a single word describing a service rendered: intimidation, removal, silencing. It wasn't just a list of Clayton's conquests. It was a record of every dirty deed, every threat, every piece of extortion and violence the sheriff and his son had used to maintain their grip on the town for the last 15 years. It was a book of secrets and sins. Ellie's eyes scanned the page, and she saw the name of the blacksmith who had left town last spring. She saw the name of a rancher whose land the sheriff had conveniently acquired after a tragic accident. Then Jonas froze. His breath hitched. He pointed a trembling finger to a line halfway down the page. Ellie leaned closer to read it. The name was Sarah Jonas. The date was 10 years ago, and the word next to it was silencing. The fever wasn't a fever. The doctor hadn't lied out of loyalty. He'd been paid. It was all there, in black and white. Jonas hadn't just lost his wife to sickness. She had been murdered. Murdered on the orders of the man who was supposed to uphold the law. A sound, a low, guttural noise of pure animal rage, tore itself from Jonas's throat. It was the sound of a decade of buried grief and guilt exploding to the surface, and from the hallway they heard a floorboard creak. Someone was awake. Clayton stood in the doorway, a pistol in his hand, his eyes bleary with sleep. But the confusion on his face was rapidly being replaced by a cold, murderous fury as he saw Jonas holding the open ledger. "You," he snarled, his voice a venomous rasp. He raised the pistol. "You should have stayed dead." There was no time to think. Jonas reacted on pure, raw instinct. He threw the heavy wooden box with all his might. It caught Clayton square in the face, staggering him. The pistol fired, the shot going wild, shattering a mirror on the wall. Ellie screamed, a sound finally torn from her after a week of silence. Jonas didn't wait for a second chance. He lunged, tackling Clayton, and the two men crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. They rolled, fists flying. Clayton was younger, stronger, but Jonas was fueled by a decade of simmering rage. He was fighting for more than his life. He was fighting for his wife's stolen justice. From downstairs, a door slammed open. The sheriff's voice boomed up the stairs. "Clayton, what in God's name is going on?" Footsteps pounded on the staircase. Ellie stood frozen for a second, the ledger clutched in her hand. This was it. The moment it all ended, they were trapped. The sheriff was coming. Then her eyes fell on the shattered mirror. She saw her own reflection, a wild-eyed stranger with a fire in her soul. She saw the ledger in her hand, the truth. She wasn't a victim anymore. While Jonas and Clayton wrestled on the floor, the gun just inches from their grappling hands, Ellie ran. Not away from the fight, but towards it. She bolted from the room, past the astonished face of the sheriff who was just reaching the top of the stairs, and she flew down the staircase. She didn't head for the back door. She ran straight for the front. She threw the heavy oak door open and burst out onto the main street, just as the sun was cresting the rooftops. People were starting to emerge from their homes, drawn by the gunshot and the smoke from the saloon. They stopped and stared, confused, at the sight of the sheriff's housemaid, half wild, clutching a book to her chest. Ellie didn't stop running. She ran to the center of the street, to the public well, the heart of the town. She scrambled onto the stone ledge, holding the ledger high above her head. Her voice, when she found it, was not a whisper. It was a roar. "Lies!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the silent storefronts. "This whole town is built on lies!" Back in the house, the sheriff, momentarily stunned, recovered his senses. "Get her!" he bellowed at his son, but it was too late. The truth was out of the box. Jonas landed one last brutal punch, dazing Clayton. He scrambled to his feet, grabbed the fallen pistol, and ran after Ellie. He burst out onto the porch just as the sheriff did. They saw Ellie standing on the well, a prophet of righteous fury. The town was waking up now. Doors were opening. Faces appeared in windows. They saw the chaos. They saw the girl. They saw the sheriff and a battered Jonas on the porch with guns in their hands. And then they saw Tommy. He emerged from the alleyway, his own gun raised, not at Ellie, but at the sheriff. "Don't you touch her!" Tommy yelled, his voice shaking but clear. The town was frozen. A silent, terrified audience to a play they had pretended not to see for years. "She has the proof!" Ellie shouted, her voice ringing with power. She held up the ledger. "It's all in here. Every crime, every man you've ruined, every family you've broken." She opened the book to a random page. Silas Croft, the blacksmith. It says right here he was removed because he wouldn't sell his shop to you. A woman in the small crowd gasped. Mrs. Croft. She clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a horrifying, sudden understanding. And the Miller Ranch, Ellie continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. Paid to have his cattle poisoned so you could buy his land for pennies. An old man in the crowd, Mr. Miller, leaned heavily on his cane, his face turning ashen. The sheriff raised his pistol, his face a mask of purple rage. That's enough. Get down from there, girl. No! Ellie screamed back. No more silence! She flipped through the pages frantically, her eyes searching. She found the name. And Sarah Jonas! He had her silenced. He murdered her because she knew. He murdered her and called it a fever. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Every eye turned from Ellie to Jonas. They saw the raw, unmistakable grief and fury on his face. They knew, in that instant, that it was true. The whispers started, the murmurs. The dam of fear that had held the town captive for 15 years was cracking. Clayton stumbled out onto the porch, his face bruised and bleeding. He saw the crowd. He saw their faces turning from fear to anger. He saw his world collapsing. He did the only thing a cornered animal knows how to do. He attacked. He lunged for Ellie, screaming her name, but Jonas was faster. He fired his pistol, not at Clayton, but at the dirt in front of his feet. The shot kicked up a cloud of dust, making Clayton flinch back. It's over, Jonas said, his voice like stones grinding together. He walked down the porch steps and stood between Clayton and Ellie, a broken rancher transformed into an avenging angel. The sheriff aimed his gun at Jonas. Get out of my way. But something had changed. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were moving. Slowly at first, then with more purpose, they began to step forward. The blacksmith's wife, the old rancher, the store owner who'd been paying protection money for years. They formed a loose circle, a human wall, around Ellie and Jonas. The sheriff looked at the faces in the crowd. He no longer saw fear. He saw judgment. His own deputies, the men who had followed his orders without question for years, hesitated. They looked at the ledger in Ellie's hand, at the faces of their neighbors, and then at their boss, and they did nothing. The power was gone. It had vanished in the morning light. The sheriff's hand trembled. He looked at his son, his ruined legacy. He looked at the town that now hated him, and his face crumpled. He slowly, deliberately, lowered his gun. It was over. Not with a blaze of gunfire, but with the deafening roar of the truth finally being spoken aloud. Clayton screamed and cursed, thrashing like a trapped animal as two of the deputies finally moved to restrain him. But no one was listening to him anymore. They were listening to the quiet sobs of the blacksmith's widow. They were listening to the survivors. Ellie's legs finally gave out. She slid down from the well, the heavy ledger falling into the dust. Jonas caught her. He held her up, and for the first time she let herself cry. Not tears of pain or fear, but tears of release. The weight was finally gone. When the dust settled, it settled on a different town. The sheriff and his son were locked in their own cells, the iron bars a fitting end to their reign. The state marshals came a week later, took one look at the ledger, and carted them away for a trial that was nothing more than a formality. The town was quiet. But it was a new kind of quiet. Not the silence of fear, but the thoughtful silence of a community waking from a long bad dream. They had to look at themselves, at the compromises they had made, and the truths they had ignored. Things didn't change overnight. But they began to change. The blacksmith's widow reopened his shop, her son hammering out the horseshoes. Old man Miller got his cattle back. A new sheriff was elected, a quiet, honest man chosen by the people he served. And back at the burned-down ranch, a new home began to rise from the ashes. The townspeople came one by one, then in groups. They brought lumber and nails, food and blankets. They came to repay a debt. They helped Jonas, Tommy, and Ellie rebuild the cabin, bigger and stronger this time. It wasn't a fortress anymore. It was a home. Ellie never covered the mirror again. Some days she would stand before it and just look at her own reflection, at the faint scars that mapped her survival. They weren't marks of shame. They were proof that she was still there. She planted a garden behind the house, her fingers digging into the rich earth, coaxing life from the barren soil. Tommy stayed. The guilt he carried was a heavy coat, but every day he worked to mend the fences, he felt it grow a little lighter. He was no longer Clayton's boy. He was Jonas's right hand. He was Ellie's protector. He was finally his own man. And Jonas found he could sit on his new porch and watch the sunset without the ghost of his wife sitting beside him. He still missed her, but the bitter rage was gone, replaced by a quiet peace. He had found a new family, not one born of blood, but one forged in fire and loyalty. The West wasn't won by gunslingers and lawmen. It was built by ordinary people who, when faced with extraordinary evil, found the courage to stand up, the courage to speak, the courage to rebuild. Jonas kept Ellie alive. Ellie gave Tommy a reason to fight. And together, they gave a whole town a reason to believe in justice again. They learned that a family isn't just who you're born to, it's who you're willing to fight for. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest of nights, a single voice can bring the dawn, do me a favor and hit that like button. It's a small click, but it helps these stories reach others who might need to hear them. And if you want to join this posse for more tales of justice, survival, and the unshakable strength of the human spirit, make sure you subscribe to the channel. There are a lot more stories out here, waiting in the dust. So I'll leave you with this question. When the time comes, will you be the one who stays silent, or will you be the one who speaks the truth no matter the cost?